Oh, sorry. Check. Check 1, check 2. Check's good. This is episode 54, provided I get through it, of the 40 Ounce Hemlock Podcast. I confess there have been times when I've attempted to do an episode and not gotten through it. I had to do the whole thing again. So the aim here is that this is episode 54. And I was almost not gonna do it. And yet, because I don't feel, man, it's so hard to know how far to go with some of this stuff. This was supposed to be a deep dive, as I said at the end of last episode. This was supposed to be a deep dive into like the arguments and the main issue that I keep gesturing at. What is that? The fatal, hopelessly fatal problems with trying to suppose, and thus theorize, that the mind is the brain. The series is called Mind the Gap. Did I say that? Episode 54, part 4 of Mind the Gap. Mind is the gap. All right? And we've talked about several gaps. I'm not going to go into that again. Don't worry. Listen. This was supposed to be a deep dive, a deeper dive into these. I want to wade you into some of these arguments so you can see this buffoonery, okay, for what it is. And again, if you're just coming in, you shouldn't be listening to this. But if you're just coming in, this is not like I'm quoting people who disagree ultimately, metaphysically, whatever, with the people who advance this propaganda that I've called the story. Again, go back and listen to at least the past 2 episodes to understand what that is, okay? Or I guess, like any other episode in this entire podcast, because it's all sort of one thing, despite the series. So this was supposed to be that. This is supposed to be a deep dive into those things. And I'm not saying it's not going to be, but there have been these 2 stories in the news in the past 2 days, and it's really tempting to try to bring them in here. And it's really tempting beyond that to try to tie all of that into the deep dive that was supposed to be going on in this episode. I have on the screen this shot of a protest, against critical race theory. And it's a shot from a video clip from PBS. And the title is something like, I don't know, what is the title? The title is something like, where people are divided over the teaching of critical race theory. So here's the first thing I do. I see this and I ask myself, this is 9 minutes and 4 seconds of my life. Am I going to watch this? I want you to ask yourself this. Am I going to watch this? Am I going to watch PBS? More on that later. PBS's presentation to me of what the divide over critical race theory consists in. You have to understand there's going to be a story here. There's going to be a set of assumptions. There's going to be a way of describing the divide, right? What's the title? Why Americans are so divided over teaching critical race theory. I'm not going to watch this, and I'll tell you why. It's because I can already tell. I've got a couple longtime listeners who have heard the series that's called Unmasking Antifa, okay, who will understand what's going on here, all right? I can already tell just by the way PBS is talking about this that they don't understand it. Okay? Why is that? Because you don't teach critical race theory. It's not something you teach. Remember in the last episode I talked about, I quoted Daniel Dennett. I know this seems totally unrelated. Just listen. I quoted Daniel Dennett saying, when he's articulating the story and its force and what it does for them in terms of their conception of intellectual history. He said, even if Darwin turns out to be wrong about the particulars, we're not giving up the more general thing. And what did he mean by that? He meant the outlook. What's the outlook? It's naturalism. It's materialism, whatever you want to call it. He said, we're not giving that up, right? Now, and before that, we had talked about, well, what ultimately does their evidence that naturalism, that materialism, what's their evidence that that's true? It's the metal detector. See, that's the problem. So they have this circular argument for why this thing is true. And they say, even if any arguments turn out to be wrong, we're not giving it up. This is how you know that it's not a science, okay? But they want you to think it's a science, so they call it science. They conflate naturalism with science, and then they call you anti-science, and they say you don't know how science works, and they say you don't understand the difference between science and pseudoscience, all right? I'm getting ahead of myself. Listen, I can already tell just by reading the title of this video that PBS does not understand what critical race theory is, because you don't teach critical race theory. Remember when a fish doesn't feel wetness. Wetness is its environment. It's what philosophers call the given. All right? A fish isn't like, it's wet in here. A person who doesn't belong in water, who doesn't, right? They're the one who feels wetness. What are you talking about, Nick? It's critical race theory is like what Daniel Dennett said he's not giving up. It's an outlook. It's a way of looking at the evidence. It has nothing to do with the evidence. See, it's like a lens. It's not, the evidence is not, remember when I made those offhanded comments about not caring about the evolutionary debates, and fossils and DNA and all this? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Those are the particulars, okay? The real work is done at the level of the outlook and the assumption of the outlook and the assumptions implicit in the outlook. So when PBS says that there's a great divide in the US over the teaching of critical race theory, I stop, because I know that you don't teach critical race theory. You teach in light of critical race theory. In other words, you teach according to an outlook, a set of assumptions. All right? But we can go a step further. What are those assumptions? And this is the other thing. This is the other reason I won't watch this, because I know what those assumptions are. What are those assumptions? Critical race theory is just Marxism. It's stupid that people call it anything else. And you know what is even more stupid? This term wokeness. I know people love to say it. I know it's so hip to call it out. Stop saying wokeness. I want to say I'm warning you. I don't want to sound that haughty. I'm warning you. Stop saying wokeness. You're making it cute. It's just Marxism. That's all it is. And so to give it another name is to facilitate it. In some measure, we can argue about the extent of the measure, but to give it another name, in other words, to not identify it as what it is at least into some sense facilitate it. So the only discussion is about how much are you facilitating it. All right? So clearly PBS doesn't know what critical race theory is, because you don't teach it. It's not a fact to be taught. It's an outlook. It's a way of looking at the facts. How does a Marxist look at the facts? How does a Marxist look at the world? A Marxist looks at the world, and ultimately a socialist, as we heard in episode 52, looks at the world and sees a conglomeration of physical things that are at bottom just accumulations of other little physical things that are combining and decombining in various physical events that are governed by physical laws, all right? And somehow these things, and thank God Darwin came along, somehow these things have combined into things that have some amount of self-force and can act in the world and do things. Okay, on what basis do they do things? Well, the only way they can keep doing what they do is to feed their appetites. They have to have fuel in the tank. And that's the baseline thing. I know this might sound so abstract. Please listen, it's going to come together. The fundamental thing is little particles doing stuff. What do we happen to find those little particles doing? Combining and decombining in various ways that just gives us the world that we see around us and us in it. We're just sets of material particles, conglomerations of material particles, and all those things, all those little things that compose us entirely, not just partially. They are us. They're identical with us, all right? We are them. All those little things are governed by the laws of physics, right? And they've just happened to come together in a way that has some amount of, momentary, 50 to 90 years of self-force. How does that happen? Well, there's certain appetites that have to be fed. Okay, so, says the Marxist, life reduces to reality for the individual, for the human person, which is what political science is concerned with. Reality for the human person reduces to feeding those appetites to stay alive. And therefore society reduces to a battle and thus a need for the distribution of the means to feeding those appetites, to continuing on. Okay? Those are the fundamental thing. Now you might say, well, isn't that, what's wrong with that? No, then you're not seeing the point. There's nothing else. Okay? If you have an appetite that says you treat me this way, and I have an appetite that says the best way to accomplish satisfying my appetite is to treat you that way, on this view, you can't say that there's some other fact about how we should treat each other. Marx says no. There's only the material. Okay? And thus there's only the individuals. There's no universal moral principles like don't stab somebody for bread. Right? There's nothing like that. There's just what happens. Okay? And you can imagine, and it's true, what Marx thought when he read Darwin. He flipped out. He's like, yes, this is it. Exactly. Okay? So PBS doesn't understand any of this, or more eerily, maybe they do. It's just Marxism. So why is it allowed to flourish? And in this story, one of the two stories that I'm talking about here that I said are tempting me to diverge from the path here. In this story, why is it now being threatened to be enforced, or I guess, effectually, materially, why is it now to be enforced by the Stasi, FBI, and Merrick Garland? What is the relation? In other words, what is the relation between the Marxism that you keep seeing me talking about and being hung up on, and the, naturalism, materialism that we're talking about in this series on the mind? In other words, why do I have this picture from this story about protests against critical race theory? Why do I have this picture up on the screen in part 4 of a series that is putatively, presumably, about the difference between the mind and the brain, and the public misconception about that due to the media propaganda about that, due to the story, due to what's the connection? Here's the connection. It's because they both share the assumption. They both share the assumption. Naturalism, materialism. I want to read you 2 quotes. Okay? I know I read a lot of quotes to you. I don't know if I've ever wanted to read 2 quotes to you like I want to read 2 quotes to you right now. Okay? I want you to understand this connection between this perhaps seemingly innocuous, insofar as it's just an academic debate about whether reality is at bottom just material or material and something else, and thus at least minimally dualistic or triolistic, quadrulistic, I don't know, right? But it's at least more than one thing. That's why we say materialism, non-materialism, right? It's hard to define exhaustively the immaterial other than saying it's immaterial. It's hard to really get, it's like, well, what are we talking about here? Well, we're just not talking about things that can be sensed. It's really not that hard, right? Like they said in the Enlightenment, they said, well, look, you know that there's no number that's so big that you cannot add 1 to it. You say, what? They say, you know that. And you're like, yeah, I know that, but what of it? And they said, the rationalists, these guys said, well, look, that means you know things that you haven't experienced and theoretically couldn't experience or would never experience empirically, like with your senses. Like you don't just sit there with an abacus, right, and keep adding 1 and know that, therefore, there is no number. You could say every number I've encountered isn't such that I can't add 1 to it, but you could not know that there is no number so great that I can't add 1 to it, and yet you know that. So the rationalist said, how do you know that? See? It's very important what you take to be the limits of knowledge and why you take the limits of knowledge to be those limits. Okay? Let me just get my bearings. And by that I mean find my mouse. I've lost my mouse. Right now my mouse is existing somewhere in the space between two monitors, which is kind of trippy because it shouldn't be allowed to exist. There it is. Okay. What do we want to say? Why am I hung up on this story about the FBI coming after parents who criticize critical race theory? I mean, obviously it has its value, just its shock value, right? But you have to understand the relation between the materialism and the naturalism that underpins the just baseline socialist state, which is what we've become, and the same materialism and naturalism which generates the Marxist view. They are, what's the old word? Bedfellows. They're not just it's the same thing. I want to read you two quotes. I'm going to read you two quotes, okay? Man, this is tough. First, listen. Why? Okay, I'm sorry. Why else? Why else would I think that it's relevant to a podcast series about the mind and the brain? All right, I'm gonna blow your mind in a second. With the sort of juxtaposition of these two statements by these two different people. Okay. But I'm almost gonna now lessen the extent to which that's going to blow your mind, because I'm going to make it really clear prior to that. In fact, I've sort of gestured at it. So go back to the very end of the second episode of this series, right? The comments at the end, the sort of like speculation and whatever that was, right? What do you got to do? If you want to change a society and you don't want to use force, what do you got to do? You have to sort of make it change itself. If you're not going to use force, force is force from the outside. That's what's implied, right? Force from the inside is not force in the traditional sense. It's self-motive, right? Right. So if you're not going to use force by logical extent, right, by deduction, you have to get it to do it to itself, because that's the opposite of using force. Well, how are you going to get a society to change itself? To get a society to change itself, or to have reason to change itself, you would have to change its conception of itself so that it acts to change its actions and its institutions and so on and so forth to follow and be in line with its conception of itself. You'd have to change its conception of itself. And to do that, you have to change the individual's conception of his self. Why? Because the society is just a bunch of individuals. Okay? How do you do that? To do that, you have to change what he, the individual, thinks a self is. How else would you change an individual's conception of themselves? Or how more effectively could you change an individual's conception of themselves than to change their conception of what a self is? Okay? Well, what is a self? Well, as it turns out, if you just think about it for a moment, a self is at least at bottom, at minimum, maybe entirely, having a mind. It's having a mind. Well, what is that? What's a mind? Here we are. What's a mind? What is a mind? What does the current culture view as the correct answer to that question? You have to change what they think about that, what they think about the self. All right? About what the self is, that is their self. To change their conception of themselves, and thus to change society's conception of itself. That's what you have to do. Okay? Now listen, this is going to get batshit crazy in a moment when I connect these two dots in just these two quotes, okay? But again, I know I'm just reiterating what was said 2 episodes ago, but I just want you to appreciate this, the process here. Trust the process. All right? The materialization or as another word for it is the secularization, but that sort of brings in more religious, overtly religious notions, but they're all there to begin with. It's just not obvious from the term. The materialization of society depends on the secularization or the materialization of political life. Well, how do you materialize or secularize political life? The secularization or materialization of political life depends on the secularization or materialization of that. Please listen to me. Of that domain of knowledge which most informs a politically advanced society. What's that? Science. You have to materialize science. You have to secularize science. Okay? Science. And so it depends upon who? Those who interpret and explain science to society at large. Okay? And there's another thing. And a most important thing. The secularization, the materialization of society via the materialization of knowledge, all right? Or the materialization of the person via the materialization of knowledge, and thus the materialization of society, however you want to slice it, okay? It depends on, listen now, we're talking about society, right? It depends on the secularization of the fundamental unit of societal and political life. What's that? It's the individual. It depends on the secularization of the individual. In order to materialize the individual, the nature of the individual has to be materialized. See? I'm trying to say the same thing in 100 different ways. We are progressing a little bit, but a lot of it is, like I said before, 2 steps forward and one step back. Okay? The nature of the human individual lies in what? What does it mean to be a self? It means to have a mind. The nature of the human individual lies in having a mind. Because the nature of the self is having a mind, right? So in order to secularize or materialize or naturalize or whatever you want to call it, society, thoroughly, the nature of the mind must be rendered material. And that's the connection, okay? You have to materialize the mind to materialize the person, to materialize the society, to materialize the government, to materialize everything. Okay? Is that clear? It's actually that simple. But I've been saying, I'm going to read you 2 quotes, and I have to stop laughing now because I'm going to have chills going down my spine in a moment. And if you don't, am I setting the bar too high here? I want to say I haven't succeeded. If you don't, I might be setting the bar too high. Man, oh man. I'm going to read you these quotes now. All right. I know I have been a little bit, or am continuing to be a little bit low energy Jeb here. I want to read you 2 quotes. I keep saying this. Just let me get to it. Let me build to it. The energy might increase. I think this is so important. Okay? And I'm sorry for the slow start here. Or I'm not. I don't know. But I'm just going to make this the point of this episode, and then we'll get on to whatever. It's either going to be a deep dive into these arguments that I keep gesturing at that show this whole view to be so absurd by their own lights, not by my lights, not by people who agree with me about what the ultimate nature of reality is, by their own colleagues. Okay? It's either going to be a deep dive into that, or we're actually just going to get into this clip that I keep saying this whole series is going to be examining, right? One or the other, but in either case, we'll get on to the other right after that. So, but just for the minute, I want to read you 2 quotes. Because there's this question before us that, depending on your level of familiarity with my shtick, might be on your mind, which is, what is this connection, this presumed connection this imagined connection, this suggested connection, this seemingly ultra important connection between, like, on the one hand, a moment ago I had in the backdrop there, these protests that are going on against critical race theory in the public schools, and the larger atmosphere, as you've heard me argue in other cases, of Marxism behind that. What's the connection between that and this just sort of seemingly academic debate that I'm talking about in this series called Mind the Gap, where the question is, what's the gap between the mind and the brain, and what do people think that gap is, and what do we know about the mind versus what do we know about the brain, and what do people say we know about the one versus the other, and what effects does that have on right? What does that have to do with Marxism? That's kind of the question we're tossing around here. And if I can get that question answered, then that's enough for this episode. And to answer that question, are you ready? I want to read you 2 quotes. All right? Okay, low energy Jeb is going to bed. There's some debate as to whether the title of Dostoevsky's famous novel is more accurately interpreted as, first, demons, or as, second, the possessed. Okay, it's been translated both ways. All right. What? Listen, that question, for my purposes here, is, wait for it, immaterial. Okay? My copy of the book carries the latter title, but it would have drawn my attention on the shelf of my favorite used bookstore, right? Where it sat, either way. Okay? Title's not important. The title's not material. Right? What's not immaterial to our purposes here is the societal. We've been talking a lot about individuals in society, right? And the role of affecting the individual's conception of itself in order to affect the society's conception of itself, in order to change the society. Because there's only 2 ways to change a society, either by force or by convincing society to change itself. Okay? What is not immaterial to our purposes here is the societal, this hat is bothering me, I apologize, significance which Dostoevsky seemed to assign to the title, however you interpret it. He is the greatest Russian novelist? I don't know. I'm not I'm not an expert on Russian novelists, but I mean, come on. He sought to identify, or maybe not identify is the right word, but point out, to exposit, to draw out a spiritual component and consequence. Listen. We're answering the question here on a certain level. Listen. He wrote this novel called Demons, and in some cases it's translated as The Possessed. Okay? What he sought to do with this novel was point out a spiritual component and consequence of the naturalistic or materialist way of looking at things. Outlook, as we said with Daniel Dennett, right? Outlook, metaphysic, that was steadily, in his time, swallowing up the more classical French liberalism, which had been all the rage amongst Russia's intelligentsia at the time. And this was a digestive process that would eventually culminate in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1918. The Marxist Revolution of 1918. Why is that important? Think about it. Dostoevsky wrote his novel in 1871. Do you see? He wrote it in 1871. When did the Bolshevik Revolution happen? In 1918. And so you begin to see why he was commonly thought of as a prophet or something close enough. Well, then what's this story? The story, we're answering the question. We're almost done. It sounds like we're launching into a whole new thing. We're not. We're almost done. Listen. The story follows a hapless academic, a hapless liberal academic who is convinced of his own enlightened nature, and you might argue in virtue of that, but I'll just say he unwittingly falls in with a band of bloodthirsty, banal, in the Hannah Arendt sense, pure Marxist revolutionaries. And he is obtusely blind to their agenda. And you might argue, because he is ever seeking their approval, and anyone's approval, okay, of his intellectual gifts. And he is, as the story plays out, tragically ignorant of the purchase price of that validation, okay? So, right, okay? Now, you begin to wonder if Dostoevsky's prophetic, field of vision merely extended from the French Revolution's inexorable mutation into Jacobinism to perhaps the Russian fascination with French liberalism's inexorable slide into the Communist Revolution, or whether maybe just he could just see further, perhaps, even than that, where to American liberalism's steady, logical descent into, well, I'll say Marxism, but there's a prior step. And that's what this whole thing is about, the connection between materialism and the naturalistic outlook that is the given, it's the received view, or it's told to you over MSNBC, as we'll see in a minute, right? When they trot out their experts, that this is the received view, that we know this now, that the story is told, right? The story is told. So when you read this novel by Dostoevsky, and you follow the plight of this character and the forces that he's up against and the way that the pressures of these forces affect his character, given his proclivities and his weaknesses and his desires and all these things, it's like, man, it's not hard to see. I'm talking purely now from a narrative perspective, from a psychological perspective. There is this interesting connection between this sort of pure academic materialism and naturalism and the more social consequences of the offshoot of those things politically, socialism, and at the extreme, Marxism. Now that was a really wordy, that's not the connection. I said this is about two quotes. I just wanted to talk about Dostoevsky's book for a second. I want to read to you two quotes. All right? Now, what did I say a little bit ago? I'm going to blow your mind. Even at my low energy level of this podcast, I said I'm going to blow your mind with two quotes. Why are these two quotes going to blow your mind? If I can find them. They're going to blow your mind because they come from two utterly disparate people with seemingly, if our connection that we're trying to establish here is yet unestablished, with seemingly disparate purposes and concerns and goals. And they're going to be seen to have fixated on the same point. And so we're going to have to ask ourselves, and this is the point here, why this point? Why is this important to both of them? I'm trying to illustrate for you the importance between the sort of like preoccupation with materialism and naturalism that goes on in a certain portion of modern West intellectual circles, but which dominates the airwaves, right? I'm trying to draw the connection between that and the more outlandish versions of and consequences of Marxism that you see going on now in our society. because I know you're watching this stuff. Like, how can this be tolerated? You have to understand that there's a connection between these two things, okay? You have to understand there's a connection between these two things. I guess more specifically what I mean by that is when you say, like, well, how can people on the other side of the aisle, like, this is so absurd, like, how could, right? If they were going to argue against it, they would have to eventually work themselves back to first principles. But they share the same first principles. Do you see? That's what the point of this is about. I want to read to you two quotes. All right. The first quote, and I said it a moment ago, after we do this episode, I'm not yet clear whether we're going to do the deep dive into the arguments to show how ridiculous it is that people go on these shows on MSNBC and all these CNN and they pretend to be experts in this field, and yet they claim the story. I want to show you how ridiculous the story is based on their own colleagues. Okay. But I said, I'm not sure whether I'm going to do that yet or whether we're just going to get into this clip that I've been saying we're going to watch. Regardless of that, when we get into the actual current state of this debate, one of the gentlemen I'm going to read to you is like an authority in this field, okay? Who's written on some of the most important questions and issues in the philosophy of mind in the past, X number of years. Very important dude, okay? And he's the first gentleman I want to quote to you. And the second gentleman has nothing to do with him. Or does he? Okay? Sorry, that's my IPA. The first quote is from a gentleman named, this won't mean anything to you now. Don't worry, it will. The first quote is from a gentleman named Donald Davidson. Okay? Remember what we're trying to tie together here. What is the connection between this seemingly academic debate I keep harping on and that this whole series is essentially me harping on? What's the connection between that and the sort of like Marxist-tinged, Marxist-flavored stuff I'm referencing in the news and that are going on right now, and that seem to be sort of an occasion for me trying to propose this connection between these two things? What's this connection between these two things? I said earlier in this episode, they share the same assumption. It's the outlook. I want you to listen to what Donald Davidson says about the mind and its relation to the brain. Donald Davidson is just a philosopher of mind, okay? But wait. Here's Donald Davidson. Quote, mental characteristics. Remember, when we say, I'm already stopping. Gosh, it's 40 ounce Hemlock Podcast. When we say mental, we are talking about from the point of view of the conscious being, all right? So don't picture fizzings and electrons, neurons, lighting up pattern networks of neurons in a brain. Like, don't picture blood flowing, and don't picture physical stuff. Don't picture material stuff. Picture what it's like to think of stuff. That's what we're talking about here. Okay? When we say mental, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about from the inside point of view. When we say physical, we're talking about from the external, from the third person, from the outside point of view. Well, neurons number 4, 5, 6, 7,000 through 8,677, and right, all those neurons lit up when he thought of that thing. We're talking about the neurons there, but here we're talking about just the mental. Think of your grandmother. The thought of your grandmother. That's the mental. You see? Okay, sorry. So here's the first quote. Here's Donald Davidson. Such a great name. Chesterton. It's Donald Davidson in his book, Mental Events. Okay. Yes, he's got an entire book called Mental Events. Why? Because he's an authority in the modern discussions of the issues in this field. So the dude has a book called Mental Events. Okay. We're going to be talking a lot more about him later. But for right now, ladies and gentlemen, Donald Davidson. He says, quote, mental characteristics are in some sense dependent or supervenient. That's a word I'm going to explain later. Supervenient, he says, or dependent on physical characteristics. Okay, stop. Let's just read it again now. Remember the whole theme of this whole thing. Remember everything we're talking about here. Now listen to the first statement again. Mental characteristics are in some sense dependent on or supervenient on and I'll explain what supervenient means later. Just take the word dependent. They're dependent on physical characteristics. In other words, mental life is dependent on brain life. In other words, the mind is dependent on the brain. In other words, the mind is essentially the brain. Okay? Now I'm going to start again, and I'm going to read straight through the second sentence. He says, starting at the beginning again, mental characteristics are in some sense dependent or supervenient on physical characteristics. This dependence might be taken to mean that there cannot be two events that are alike in all physical respects, but different in some mental respect. What's he talking about? He's saying if it's true that everything about the mind is determined by the brain because the mind is the brain, then all the conditions of the brain are sufficient to explain any particular condition or instance or feature of thought or mental life or thinking or consciousness. Or the physical conditions are sufficient. So, given that that's the case, it can't be the case that we could have two sets of identical physical conditions but different mental products of those conditions. The same physical events would always necessitate the same mental events or thoughts or conscious life or whatever. You see? The physical determines the mental. The mental supervenes on or depends on the physical. Donald Davidson says this supervenience or whatever, this dependence might be taken to mean that there can't be two events that are alike in all physical respects but different in some mental respects, or that an object cannot alter in some mental respect without altering in some physical respect. In other words, the physical rules everything, and the mind is a product of the brain. That's Donald Davidson. That's one of the two quotes that I wanted to read to you. Now, who is the other quote? I'm trying to draw this connection between this seemingly benign, merely academic, in the derogative sense, debate about materialism versus dualism, or materialism versus materialism and something else, right? About one thing versus two things, or one thing versus many things. I'm trying to draw a connection between this and the Marxism and the effects of this Marxist spirit that you see going on all around you. If you listen to this show, then you know what I mean by that. So I'm just going to leave it there, right? What's the connection? That was Donald Davidson. I'm now going to read to you the second quote, and then we'll be done. The second quote is this, and it's going to sound, I mean, if we line these up, I'd love to do just like a little like chapter and verse, or maybe we could do like stanza, like sentence, like clause by clause. It's going to sound like I'm repeating myself here. I'll read this following quote, and then I'll tell you who it is. The development of the ideal side, the development of consciousness, is preceded by the development of the material side, the development of the external conditions. First, the external conditions change. First, the material side changes. Then consciousness, the ideal side, changes accordingly. Sounds kind of like Donald Davidson's quote, doesn't it? The physical determines the mental. The brain determines the mind. So you could never have two differences in mind which weren't undergirded by two different states of the brain. The brain determines the mind. And the most likely explanation of this fact is because the brain is the mind. See, that's the step that Darwin, in the story that we talked about earlier, Darwin fills in that. He's like, okay, well, is that because they're the same thing, right? See? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't tell you who the second quote was by. Oh, I'm sorry. It sounded like Donald Davidson also, didn't it? No, it was Joseph Stalin. It was Joseph Stalin. Now you might say, why is Joseph Stalin writing about the relation between the mind and the brain? And I hope I don't have to answer that question at this point. So we'll see in episode, what is it? 45, 55? I don't know. 55. 55. See you next time. All right. No, stop. reverse. It's not the case that we will see you in the next episode yet. I listened to the end of this episode. This is me adding an addendum way after the fact. I listened to the end of this episode and I was like, here you're claiming all the while that you're going to be so explicit about all this in order to sort of like reveal the assumptions that make the whole thing so ridiculous. So you're going to be real like with a fine-tooth comb, right? And then I got to the end of that juxtaposition between the two quotes, and I think I was just so excited by, I told you before that my nerves were like it gives me goosebumps, right? I think I was so excited about having juxtaposed them that I just got real cryptic. And I was like, and if you don't see it, and then I went back and listened to it, and I was like, why would you say if you don't see it, then, I mean, your whole point was to draw out how important it is that these two quotes are like identical, given who they're by. So now I just want to do what I should have done the first time I recorded this episode and make that really explicit. It's this. Remember, these guys are one is a modern, naturalistic, materialistic, analytic philosopher of mind, and the other one is Stalin. And we read these quotes last time in the last we just read these quotes. See, I'm thinking it's the next episode I'm going to make this addendum. We just read these quotes, right? And you could almost line them up like clause by clause. They're saying the exact same thing. So why is that so important to understanding, I guess, what I probably referred to as the inexorable slide from the scientism of the good old days, with the gang, Richard Dawkins and P.Z. Myers, the scientism, right? All questions are ultimately answered via evolution and materialistic evolution, right? The scientism. What's the connection between that, the good old days, and this modern thing, this now thing? All right, people call it woke, whatever. It's not woke. All right, it's Marxism. What is it? What? And I put these two quotes together to show you a representative of this latter outlook, juxtaposed with an archetypal representative of Marxism. Why were the two quotes so identical? That's what I should have made explicit when I ended this episode, and now I'm adding to it. It's this. If, as Donald Davidson and Stalin say, I'm going to go real slow. If, as they say, mental life, all mental phenomena, what philosophers call mental phenomena, like everything interior from the point of view of the thinker, the perceiver, out, like your whole mental life, okay? Everything. If, as they say, mental activity, mental life, mental phenomena, all conscious life, and therefore its contents, because you'll notice that's the only way we can identify mental life, is by reference to its content, the thing it's about. You can say, no, we see certain brain patterns. No, you're inferring from those brain patterns that they're correlated with a state of mind that could only be known if the guy on the table said, I'm thinking of blank. You see? That gap can't be closed. You have to have the report from the internal subject, the thinker, saying, he's on the MRI table, and you're like, okay, think of an orange. And he's like, okay, I'm thinking of an orange. And then you look at the scan, and you're like, okay, those neurons must somehow be associated with thinking of an orange. And I know that sounds cartoonish, but that's about as far as the theoretical underpinnings of the thought go. And that's why this whole thing is such a scam. And if you don't quite see that yet, just bear with me. The reason I juxtapose these two quotes is that if it's true, what Davidson and what Stalin are saying, that all of mental life, all conscious life, and therefore its contents, in other words, all of it, everything you know as a thinking being, everything you've experienced as a thinking being, okay? I just watched this Tim Pool clip where he's worried about Neuralink becoming this brain in a vat thing. Okay, that's a separate thought. We're going to have to do another episode on that. He's wrong, and he's wrong because he doesn't understand this. If all of that is utterly dependent and thus determined by the physical realm. This is just a long way of saying that the mind utterly depends on the brain. If that's true, listen, now, I'm going to go real slow. I'm sorry. This is so, when you see it, you're like, wait, what? If that's true, then the only mental realities, you call them ideas, experiences, perceptions, whatever you want to call them, the only mental realities, we'll call them ideas, are those that are produced by individuals, what philosophers call subjective minds. Now, if these are the only ideas, then those are the only minds. If these are the only ideas, then there are only subjective ideas. If there's only subjective ideas, then no objective idea can govern or judge between subjective ideas, because to govern or judge between two would make it objective. But there are none of those. Okay? There are none of those. If there's only subjective ideas, then no objective idea can govern between two subjective ideas. This is why, listen now, this is why Karl Marx said there are no eternal ideas. This is what he meant. Why? You might be saying, you're just saying that. Why? There is no eternal mind behind the world which could hold eternal ideas. Put the other adjective or descriptor or name, right? There's no objective mind behind the world that could house, right, in which could reside objective ideas. Okay? There are only little minds. And they, listen now, are completely determined by the matter that composes the brains that give rise to them. In other words, as both Davidson and Stalin said, the mental is dependent on the physical. And so you can begin to see how Davidson's quote and Stalin's quote align so precisely, because they're concerned with the mind-brain relation. And you begin to see why here. And the relationship that they're asserting is an assumption that both materialistic scientism, the Dawkinsy guys, right, and Marxism share in common. This is why, what's going on? What happened with, this is why didn't Dawkins get canceled or something? This is why. It's swallowing, it's the Brett Weinstein thing, right? This is why Brett Weinstein won't escape the woke mob, okay? At least theoretically. or Jordan Peterson, because they won't give up the assumption at bottom. Not granted, Jordan Peterson's way more concerned with the personal outwards, the subjective, right? But he talks about the subjective point of view, the internal, the mind, the psychological point of view from the thinker. He talks about that. But he always does it within the framework of believing the materialist evolutionist story about the origin of the brain in which he thinks all this stuff is happening, okay? Ultimately, I mean, he's, like I said, I think I said before, he's going to go down fighting, obviously. He's never going to submit, but he can't beat it, is what I'm saying, because he shares the bedrock assumption. Until that's given up, there's no way out of it, okay? If everything's material and everything's accidental, and mind is just a result in these individual instances of these comings about from the bottom up, then the only ideas that exist are subjective ideas in those minds. And if those are the only ideas that remember, listen, if I say you should not murder, that's an idea. That's like a moral, a normative, it's an idea. It's a claim about a truth in reality, right? But if that's only being said by minds numbers 7, 9, 27, and 38, right? And others disagree. There's no idea objective to those two that can determine which is correct and which is incorrect. There's no such thing as correct and incorrect, because to be correct or incorrect means to correspond to that which is actually the case, which is true, right? There's just the little individual ideas. There's no objective mind behind the world in which an objective idea could exist that could decide between the individual. That's why Dostoevsky said, if there's no God, right, all is permissible. People so misunderstand that, right? They're like, well, I wouldn't go and kill people. That's not the point. The point is that there's no idea that can make doing that versus not. There's no argument, coherent, cogent, logical, right? There's no non-specious way to get from no objective ideas exist. Like Marx said, no eternal ideas exist. There's no way to get from that to you should not do X, Y, or Z. You can't do it. They all admit you can't do it, right? So that's the connection between the two. Okay? They're concerned with making sure you know the origin of all ideas, and thus what sorts of ideas can't exist, and thus what that means for morality. Here now the government's in charge of morality because it's merely a matter of power, and it's merely, right? There's no, it's power. It's not scales. It's not the balance. There's no, right? A scale represents objectivity, right? We're weighing against something. None of that. That's the connection. It's Marxism. That's the connection. I remember the first time I read a book in this like line of thought, this what we now call wokeness, but in academia, the critical race theory, right? Like we're talking about the parents protesting. Critical race theory itself just grows out of this more general outlook. It's an outlook. You don't teach it. You teach according to it. I remember reading a book in a history class in college that was written in this outlook. And it was interesting that every single word in the book that expressed any sort of value. See, there's statements of fact and there's statements of value. And you're not used to thinking about different statements like this, right? Then you're not used to distinguishing between the two. But when you start distinguishing between the two, you realize how many statements of value are involved in your thinking from one statement of fact to the next. And that's been an important discovery of the philosophy of science in the past 100 years and has caused huge problems for people who say they are fundamentally and solely adhered to the data, because looking at the data itself doesn't do anything for you until you assume some values. And then the question becomes, where did you get those values? Okay, when I read, that's just an aside about the philosophy of science, now, which is the field that Davidson works in. Now, when I read this book as an undergrad, it was called Ideologies of the Raj, and like it was about the British occupation, the British time in India, right? And it was written according to this sort of like colonialist, post-colonialist, what in another offshoot is critical race theory, this outlook, right? And every single word expressing a value in the book was put in scare quotes, single quotes. Why? Because to not think about it, because to not disquote it would be to assume that it had any sort of binding nature over anyone else's idea of what actually corresponded to the word that was being used to express that value. For instance, justice. Why assume that what this group of people over here thinks is justice is what this people over here thinks of justice? So when you're writing objectively from an academic point of view, you can't say justice, you have to say justice. Because there is no, sorry audio people, that was me doing scare quotes. It's disquotation, right? There's no objective idea that any one idea of justice could adhere to, could correspond to. So there is no objective justice, and since there's no objective justice, you always have to write justice, or even something so simple as ought, in scare quotes. Is that what they're called? Scare quotes? Anyways, do you see? I hope it's clear now. I hope it's clear the reason I gave these two quotes, and I hope it's clear what's going on with PBS's misunderstanding of people protesting the teaching of critical race theory. You don't teach critical race theory. You teach the outlook. You look at facts through this lens, and you don't let people question the lens. You cancel them. Peace.